Vice Chairman, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow scholars, it's a privilege to stand up here. I'm going to maybe change the subject a little bit and try and teach you a little bit or tell you a little bit about my experiences to do with agroforestry. And many of you may be wondering what the hell agroforestry is. I came across agroforestry a few years ago, but I didn't really understand how it worked. I didn't really understand what the benefits could be. And the chance to use a Nuffield Scholarship to travel and understand this better was just an ideal opportunity. But firstly, a big thank you. Thank you for Nuffield for taking a risk, instilling your trust in me. A big thank you to the NFU Mutual Charitable Trust for funding my travels. And a big thank you to my wife and family for letting me go, really, to the countries that I've seen that are listed there. And thank you to my hosts in the various countries. So why did I pick agroforestry? Well, our own farm on the edge of the fens in Cambridgeshire. This is a picture I took back in 2007 when we took the tenancy on. And it worried me intently as someone that had trained in soil scientist, watching our most valuable resource blowing across the fens and disappearing, well, not over the hedge, but over the ditch. And I thought there must be a better way. And it got me thinking. And as we've already heard, we've got some big issues globally. Soil and water resource degradation, climate change, population growth, all things that we're having to deal with on a global basis, but also very much on a local basis too. We've got some big challenges ahead as agriculturalists. We have at the moment our model of high input monocultural systems. Is that fit for purpose going forward? Is it tomorrow's approach or is it yesterday's approach? Inputs are going to be more expensive. Are they going to be less available? Is a big question. We need to increase productivity. We need to use the resources we have better, and we need to protect and enhance biodiversity all at the same time. And there's some big challenges. It's fairly well understood that trees are important for climate change adaptation in terms of carbon sequestration and protecting soils and the land. But could trees have an important role in agriculture, not forestry? Is agroforestry a mixture of the two, an alternative approach? Let me explain. It's certainly not new. Look back to the late 19th century, early 20th century in mainland Europe, and trees formed a bigger part of the landscape, but our policies have been to remove trees on agricultural land for the last 40 years. In the UK, we have probably the lowest area of tree cover of anywhere in Europe. And we have a target to move towards 16% tree cover. I don't think that's going to be possible by small pockets of woodland on scrubby bits of land on the edge of farms. But I think agroforestry could actually help us make a significant contribution to tree planting targets. So what is agroforestry? Well, it's a mixture of any tree type and any farming system type, whether that be livestock grazing, whether that be sheep or cattle or poultry or pigs, or it could be crops, vegetables, cereals, etc. It's any combination of tree and any combination of land use underneath. The important thing to remember, it's a complementary combination. The two have to work together and be beneficial to each other. My focus and my interest was very much on silvo-arable systems, so that's arable crop production and trees, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So agroforestry is not a mixture of forestry and agriculture. It's a new combination. It's a new farming system with modern agriculture in mind. It uses field-scale machinery, so we don't have to go out and buy lots of different kit. We can use the kit we've already got on farm. But it does use longer timescales. Annual cropping mixed with longer rotations of tree crops of a whole different type, whether that be a timber tree, a fruit tree, a nut tree, a medicinal tree, whatever. The question I'm often asked is, what about resource utilization and competition of resources if you put trees in the system? I learned when I traveled to the States and Canada and in Europe that with agroforestry systems, there is improved soil and water quality protection. The trees intercept water across the landscape. They buffer it from rainfall. They utilize it better. The water that we see flooding around at the moment all over the landscape can be taken up by trees when the crops are unable. It also reduces wind speeds significantly. This results in reduced evaporation and water loss from crops and better crop water utilization. I know for many of my neighbours, it's a problem trying to get out there with their sprayers. Well, many of the farms I saw travelling around in the States with Agroforestry, they never had a problem going in and spraying because the significant reductions in wind speed meant that their access to their crops was much improved. Microclimates on a local basis are also modified because of these reductions in wind speed. It's warmer in the early spring, it's warmer in the late autumn, so that the environment for crops to grow is significantly improved. How about, as we've just heard, nitrogen? Well, some studies in France have shown that with agroforestry, there's a 50% reduction in end-use loss compared to an arable production system. How does that happen? Because any nitrogen that's not utilised by crops and potential for leaching is captured by the tree roots, which root at a different level, which I'll explain in a minute. And this actually utilises the nitrogen, stops it leaching, and turns it into carbon. Travelling around states and Canada, I visited farmers and I visited research institutes, and I learnt a lot about how these systems can operate. In our northerly latitudes, a tree orientation based north-south helps reduce shade from the trees and competition and keeps the crop in the alleys growing. Different tree species need different levels of management to reduce the shade and the competition between the trees. And indeed, some crops and indeed varieties have more shade-tolerant approach than others. Maize is much more intolerant of shade than, say, something like wheat. One of the important things is that crops and trees use their resources in terms of water, light, nutrient at different times. Crops typically will take up water and utilize nutrients and utilize sunlight much earlier in the season than trees. So they're using it, say a wheat crop would use its nutrient and water and light from April through till, say, June, and then it's dying. Whereas a tree crop will carry on using those resources much longer. So you're extending the cropping season. You're using those resources over a much longer period. And as farmers, I'll challenge you all. You're all members of the Flat Earth Society. You all think two-dimensionally, never more than a metre above ground and a metre below ground. Think of all the space that you're not utilising. If you all want a bigger farm, it's out there for the grabbing. The roots can go down deeper of trees, the trees can grow up. You can get improved utilisation from the soil and improved utilisation of both water and sun and photosynthesis. This struck home to me. This was the light bulb moment for me in France, looking at tree stumps that had been exhumated and the difference between forestry trees and agroforestry trees. And under a forest situation in an undisturbed soil, the tree roots are very near the surface because that's where all the energy and nutrients is in the topsoil. In an agroforestry system, you force the little buggers deeper because you're cultivating the top zone. And the arable crops use the zone near the surface and use all the nutrients and water and light, and they force the tree roots to go underneath. So you're actually exploiting not only a bigger timescale and extending your cropping, you're exploiting a bigger area. You can make your farm bigger. And within that process, trees draw up nutrients from deeper in the soil which aren't accessed by crops. They drop those in leaf litter. That leaf litter decomposes and is available to crops subsequently. So free fertilizer. Having regular lines of trees in the system brings a whole new dimension in terms of biodiversity. Regular effect beetle banks, splitting up monoculture into a polycultural system. There's certainly benefits I saw around the globe, both in the northern US and in China and in Europe, in terms of much better biological control of pests that we see on a regular basis in cereals. And there was anecdotal evidence that they were using much lower levels of pesticides. So how do we compare productivity between these systems? Well, simply, if you had 1 hectare of agroforestry, a mixture of trees and crops, that would be equal to 0.6 hectares of trees grown on its own and 0.8 hectares of crops grown on their own. That's a land equivalent ratio of 1.4. That means an LER of 1.4 is 100 hectares of agroforestry produces as much crop and tree products as 140 hectares of farmland where they're grown separately. And you say, how is that possible? It's because you're cropping over a longer time period and you're cropping a bigger area. And this has been borne out by research over a 6-year period in Europe with 12 different countries working together, Cranfield University leading it in the UK, and they looked at 42 different tree crop combinations, and they ended up with land equivalent ratios of between 1.1 and 1.4. So there's practical evidence to show this. Spending time with a French farmer, and my French is rubbish, and his English wasn't very good, but the language of agriculture got us through. Looking at his walnut wheat agroforestry system in France, in terms of profitability, the trees alone were worth 120,000 euros per hectare. I'd swap my farm with his any day of the week. Not to mention the protein production he was actually achieving from the nut production on its own, which any kind of pea or bean crop paled into insignificance in relation to the protein that he was producing off that farm. In most examples around the world, I found trees of a density between 80 to 120 trees per hectare was ideal. Tree rows of between 24, 36, or 48 meters work really well. At 100 trees per hectare stand, productivity could be maintained. Profitability was equal to or better than monocultural systems. Alley crops maintain the annual income. Trees maintain the long-term asset. The Chinese can't be wrong. There's so many of them. 18% of the Earth's population, by my count, are Chinese farmers. In Henan province alone, there's 3.2 million hectares of paulownia and wheat grown together. In the 1970s, this was desolate land. The soil washed into the Yellow River. Now it's reclaimed and it's productive arable land, mixing trees and wheat together. A complicated graph. In essence, the take-home story is, over time, over the life scale of a 12-year rotation, the crop yields dip a little bit over time as the trees grow because of the shading and competition. But the output from the trees in terms of biomass and in terms of economic output more than compensates for that, and it ends up as a more productive, more profitable system. Indeed, I made sure I did my own bit of resource utilization on my travels to make sure I was using the space that was around me. We have some challenges. Land tenure is an issue. I'm a tenant farmer, so planting trees is maybe not so easy for me as some of you that own your own land. But maybe new shared ownership models might be needed. We have separate forestry and agricultural policies in the UK, which is a nightmare. We have the Pillar 1 cap reforms taking place. Planting trees on land can make it ineligible for agricultural production, but we are facing those head-on and making some changes. Impacts on me from Nuffield. We now have 52 hectares of agroforestry on our own farm. I'm taking that forward. Global agroforestry and agriculture have a much better understanding of these issues thanks to Nuffield, and I've met people right around the globe sharing the same passion and interest. And I'm now involved in lobbying and policy and lobbying in the UK and at an EU level. So to wrap up, really, I think for construction there was a breakthrough moment. I think for agriculture there is a climate-smart breakthrough in the form of agroforestry. My 3 messages to you are: UK farmers should adopt 20% of their land as agroforestry. Agroforestry is one of the few options with the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, help protect natural resources, and produce more. So go home, walk outside, look down, look up, and crop the extra dimension.